Well, hello and welcome. Welcome to our regular members and a welcome to the Buchanan tribe. Will the Buchanans please stand up and show who they are? Please stand up. And there is a docent from the Buchanan cabin here as well, and I'm going to send you a little bit more information about that tonight. But today's speaker is a descendant, a longtime descendant of the Buchanan family. Still got the same name, and they only had boys, so the name stayed the same. And sit tight, you're going to hear a wonderful story. Bob Buchanan.
Thank you, Jean. I'm honored to be asked to make this presentation, and I'm astounded to see family members here, some coming from Brooklyn, New York, to see friends from Davidson College days, friends from my church. Even my old high school headmaster's grandson came out today to listen to me. So, I'm Bob Buchanan, and I started coming to Tennessee History Club meetings 3 years ago. At that time, I recognized how impressive it is that Jean can we lower the lights? That Jean can find speakers week after week for club programs. I've been involved with the Tennessee Historical Society since 2008 and with the Tennessee State Museum since 2013, and neither of those organizations carries out a speakers series as ambitious and impressive as Jean has organized. At that time, I did not imagine that I would be asked to make a presentation before this club, but here I stand. Probably 2 years ago, I mentioned to Jean that my paternal ancestral line includes members of the original group of settlers who came to the French Lick on the Cumberland in late 1779. I think the weather we have today is in honor of that time. Last year, Jean asked if I would present a talk about my family's now almost 250-year presence in Middle Tennessee. I thought about the matter and slowly recognized that my family's story and experiences would be worthy of sharing if I could put it together in some sort of good order. To tell this story, it is helpful to recognize what the first settlers accomplished. They, including members of my family, arrived to a virgin wilderness, a place without housing or roads, a landlocked area over 1,100 river miles from the sea. Here they established their way of life and culture. They founded a self-sufficient and self-sustaining community which attracted an ever-growing number of later settlers. They grew crops, managed herds, started early industries, and by 1796 had achieved the status of statehood. By the 50th year following first arrival, their fellow settler was President of the United States. My family was part of this amazing transformation. My forebears were active participants in this history, not merely detached bystanders. And my family's involvement went beyond just what they did. The Buchanans represented on many levels who the first settlers were, where they had come from, what was their mindset, what were their hopes and dreams, their motivations, and ability to work together to achieve a common goal. As representative participants, my family allows us to gain a deeper understanding of how the British settlers' British culture was successfully transplanted to the Cumberland, a fusion of ambition, hard work, and self-confidence. I will introduce you to members of my family to see how future generations will carry on the family enterprise of farming and providing for themselves. Along the way, you will meet a Tennessee governor and a winner of the Nobel Prize, a Nobel Prize. Click. This is a excuse me. This diagram is part of my family tree showing my direct paternal line and a few collateral relations. I will refer frequently to the second of the several John Buchanans on this diagram, a man I will refer to as Major John. He is my great-grandfather's great-grandfather. That's 7 generations back on my paternal line. So including his father, also named John, I'm an 8th-generation Nashvillians. The Buchanans are of Scottish ethnicity and Reformed Protestant religious faith. The Buchanans were yeoman farmers before arriving in America, and farming remained a prime focus for several succeeding generations up to the 1960s. Scotch-Irish, Presbyterian, farming, all characteristics of those who populated what became Middle Tennessee. But there are additional intangible factors which are representative of the first settlers as a whole. My Buchanan family's experience here evidences a shared spirit of ambition, a stalwart work ethic, and a mindset which would not accept failure. And Major John himself is the ideal representative of the early settlers. He arrived on the Cumberland in December 1779 at age 20, a few days ahead of the party led by James Robertson. Major John and others had begun construction on what is referred to as the Bluff Station or French Lick Station prior to Robertson's arrival. The Bluff Station is what is now commemorated by the Fort Nashborough replica downtown. And while Major John's father and 2 brothers were also among the first settlers, those 3 were killed by Indians during the 1780s, while Major John lived to be 73, dying in 1832 of natural causes at Buchanan Station on Mill Creek in Donaldson. 53 years here. It is Major John's life which represents the advancement of colonial British culture to the Cumberland, which survived the periodic Indian attacks and created the 19th century agrarian way of life which characterized Middle Tennessee. But to develop a talk so far removed in time from my forebears left me with questions, both substantive and procedural. I would want to learn, click, why my forebears left Scotland or Northern Ireland, what factors determined where they would settle in America, why then decide to come to the wilderness frontier of the Cumberland Basin, what risk had to be acknowledged and weighed, what footprints had these pioneers left, and where might I look to find them? Fortunately, the history of Nashville's founding and the planting of British colonial culture here has attracted the attention of researchers, historians, and writers over the years. So to these several and various works I turn. I have several of these books on the front table. Click. In 2009, Bill Career and other Sumner County historians published Founding of the Cumberland Settlements, the first atlas, 1779 to 1804, which describes the early settlements and provides maps of the more than 1,500 North Carolina land grants awarded to first settlers and Revolutionary War soldiers and militia members for their service. Several of these grants were awarded to or later acquired by and registered to Major John or other Buchanan relatives. This atlas also lists the 435 settlers killed by Indians in Middle Tennessee between 1780 and 1795. Next slide. In 2012, Paul Clements, a childhood friend of mine and a friend to many of you, I'm sure, published his monumental Chronicles of the Cumberland Settlements, 1779 to 1796, in which Paul has gathered as many accounts of life and events from that 17-year period as he could locate from dispersed and relatively inaccessible collections, and then he republished them in chronological order. Many entries reference the Buchanan family, and note the term settlements, plural. The 18th century settlements stretched along the Cumberland from today's Clarksville to a point east of Carthage, Tennessee. In these two works, I have found the footprints which I was seeking. Next slide. Another book which provided answers to other of my questions. Many of you have read or are familiar with David Fisher's 1989 work, Albion's Seed, 4 British Folkways in America. Albion is an ancient Greek and Latin reference to the British Isles, and Professor Fisher's theory is that 17th and 18th century immigration from Great Britain to seed new communities in North America could be classified as belonging to one of 4 distinct waves of immigration. Each wave was distinctive in terms of which area of Great Britain the settlers were coming from, where in America the particular group primarily settled, and most significantly, the set of cultural values, attitudes, customs, and other folkways the given group transplanted from Britain to the colonies. The first wave came from eastern England and went to the Massachusetts in large numbers from 1629 to 1640s. This group created the Puritan culture of the early Bay State. The second wave, running from 1642 to 1775, consisted of members of the royal elite of southern England and their large numbers of indentured servants. This group primarily settled in Virginia and created the Cavalier Society of the Virginia Tidewater. Next came the wave coming from the northern Midlands of England and from Wales from 1675 to 1725, which settled in the Delaware Valley, planting the Quaker society and culture of William Penn. The last wave will be the one which interests us today, for it included my Buchanan ancestors. This group was mostly composed of yeoman farmers and farm workers and came from the borderlands of northern England and Scotland, or were Scottish farmers who had been previously resettled in Northern Ireland. These people have become known as the Scotch-Irish, but that term is a misnomer in that there was nothing Irish about them in their religion, their politics, or attitude towards life. These tough, independent folk had tired of mistreatment by their absentee landlords and resented the interference their religious beliefs faced from the established Anglican Church. Conformity with the English Church was out of the question. They were determined to better their material circumstances, and if doing so required a trip across the sea, they were willing to leave. As a group, they were hardworking and knew how to raise crops and manage herds. They were literate, and while not well-to-do, most were able to pay for their ship's passage. Most notably, no one in this group who was to leave his old home was so impoverished of spirit as to have surrendered his hopes, his pride, or dreams of a better life. From 1718 to 1775, this last wave came chiefly to Pennsylvania, then filtered down the valleys to the south and west to the back country of Virginia and the Carolinas, hoping to find land they could own. This fourth wave entered America at Philadelphia, but did not find a warm welcome there from the Quakers already established there. The Scotch-Irish were different in dress, speech, religion, and attitude. One recorded in his diary that he felt that the Quakers looked upon him as if he were a barbarian. Harriet Arnault states the case more bluntly, quote, "Most settlers in the New World hated the Scotch-Irish. His ideas were held to be subversive, for he believed in the individual conscience and the heresy of complete separation of church and state, views prescribed in most colonies," close quote. But these new arrivals demanded to be treated with respect, even when dressed in rags. There was no spirit of subordination, as is often found in the lower ranks of a society. This fierce and stubborn pride would remain a hallmark of high importance, a characteristic of the fourth wave as it spread to occupy the colonial backcountry. The Buchanan family conformed to this group norm in all respects. In 1755, John Buchanan Sr., my ancestor, was married and living in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. History does not tell us where or when he was born, but I assume that John Sr. was a Scotch-Irish immigrant. There is a record of a John Buchanan born in Northern Ireland in 1725. That's 300 years ago. Assume that he came to Philadelphia in 1750. That would give him time to meet a girl, marry, and move west. 2 children were born in Lancaster County, but his son, Major John, was born January 12, 1759 in Harrisburg, as were 2 younger siblings, those being his younger brother Samuel, born in 1760, and their sister Nancy, born in 1762. When the John Buchanan family left Pennsylvania is uncertain. I now need to acknowledge 2 other books, really a 2-volume set, which opened the world of the colonial frontier to me. Harriet Simpson Arno's 1960 Seed Time on the Cumberland and her 1963 Flowering of the Cumberland. If the colonial frontier experience interests you, or if it is the story of the settlement of the Cumberland River Basin you want to understand, Arno's 2 books are must-do reading. Paul Clement's Chronicles and Pereira's Atlas are great reference works, but it is Arno's vast research of the period distilled into her novelistic prose which brings the pioneer experience to life. In these 2 books, I was able to find answers to my remaining questions. Arno refers several times to Buchanan settlers to document the aspect of pioneer life she describes. I will quote her works throughout this talk. If one person here reads Seed Time as a result of this talk, I will know that my effort has been rewarded. The Scotch-Irish ended up in the backcountry of the British colonies because those regions were less densely settled. Life there was less likely to be strictly regulated. This suited their temperament very nicely. And the backcountry was another step closer to the beckoning and endless tracts of land to the west. The backcountry populations of Virginia and the Carolinas was as great as 90% composed of Scotch-Irish stock, including my Buchanan kin. Prior to the French and Indian War, the western extent of British colonies along the southern Atlantic was somewhat uncertain. French and Spanish interests were acknowledged to exist beyond the Allegheny Appalachian Mountains, but there was no hard border. But when the French and Indian War concluded in 1763, the French agreed that the English colonies extended to the Mississippi River. But also in 1763, King George III proclaimed a line following the Eastern Continental Divide, beyond which English colonial settlement would not be allowed without 1, the consent of any affected Indian tribe, and 2, the express approval of the Crown Colony holding jurisdiction over the land area in question. This proclamation line was not intended to halt westward colonial expansion for all time, but was imposed so that westward expansion, when it occurred, would be orderly and not the cause of conflict with the tribes. The governors in Williamsburg, New Bern, and Charleston did not want unplanned settlements beyond the mountains, creating unrest with the tribes, while, in response, those new settlers demanded protection by armed forces from back east. A question I have asked concerning the growing number of settlers in the backcountry concerns the acknowledged risk one would face if a possible move across the mountains to new lands were contemplated. We will consider many other risks later in this talk, but I think the greatest single risk was whether a settler could obtain lawful ownership to the land the settler hoped to acquire. What lawful authority could make the conveyance or validate a claim? Could the approval specified in the 1763 proclamation line be achieved? Certainly various land speculators hoped so. One of these was North Carolina Judge Richard Henderson. Some seepage of settlement had already occurred in what is now Upper East Tennessee. The British were established on the Upper Holston River at Watauga and at Nolichucky, each one the result of negotiation with elements of the Cherokee Nation. Henderson organized a group of investors using the name the Transylvania Company, and in 1775, at a council meeting lasting several days, The Transylvania Company reached agreements with the Cherokee under the leadership of Chief Attacullaculla, whereby the Cherokees sold to the Transylvania Company the right to 20 million acres of land in Kentucky and Tennessee, or what would become Kentucky and Tennessee, for 10,000 pounds, that's the currency, worth of manufactured goods. Henderson, to comply with the 1763 proclamation, sent this agreement to the colonial governments of Virginia and North Carolina for approval. Virginia promptly refused to recognize the validity of the sale. North Carolina neither gave its approval nor disapproval. But with the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, was George III's proclamation line still to be honored? Henderson continued to promote his claim and convinced James Robertson and John Donaldson to agree to purchase land on the Cumberland River from the Transylvania Company and to organize settlement parties to move there in late 1779. The John Buchanan family did not subscribe to purchase land from the Transylvania Company and was independent of the Robertson-Donaldson parties. What must the Buchanans and others considering a move west have thought about the prospects of success? What did they know about where they might settle, and what were the risks of both leaving the backcountry and moving to an even newer frontier? Arnaud's Seed Time is very helpful in sorting through these issues. Arnaud describes the decades-long interaction between the white settlers in the western lands as constituting the, quote, the long learning, close quotes. During the lengthy period in the backcountry, the colonists had learned how to live in the woods. They became expert in the use of knives and firearms, of the broad axe and the felling axe. They learned how to hunt and how to adopt their agricultural knowledge to the conditions of the backcountry. During the long learning, the long hunters, such as Daniel Boone and his predecessors, brought back reports regarding the lands, forests, waters, and soils beyond the mountain wall. And from these reports, the eastern colonists learned that nature to the west was strikingly similar to that in the backcountry. Living west of the mountains would not create any new risk to settlement in terms of climatic factors, availability of forest resources and wild game, the availability of water resources for navigation and growing crops, and moving west would not confront any unknown endemic diseases. Their experiential knowledge had produced a high degree of self-confidence among the settlers, and the fruits flowing from self-confidence over a number of years cannot be overstated. They readily recognized the basic needs for water, food, and shelter, but those necessities had not prevented the settlement of the backcountry. Would moving to the Cumberland really be so different? Would the future on the Cumberland not be a repetition of what already had happened east of the mountains? Adequate food would be supplied by the herds and flocks they would bring with them, from what they would plant, grow, and harvest, and for what game they could hunt and harvest from the forest and waters. Obtaining shelter would take time and effort, but they knew how to build log homes. They knew which trees were best for walls, for flooring, for roofs and shingles. Wood from the forest would also provide the wooden portion of tools, the handles for axes, the frames for plows and home looms. Gunpowder would be made from the nitrates found in the deposits of bat droppings, sulfur from evaporating water from sulfur springs, and charcoal from burning soft wood. They knew how to get by for the time it took for their way of life to become firmly established on the new frontier. Click. The risk of moving another 250 to 300 miles west were: 1, how to acquire valid land title; 2, how to deal with the Indian presence; 3, how to establish transportation and communication links back east; and 4, how to establish commercial links for the purchase and sale of goods; and finally, how to establish a degree of law and order in a place so distant from the established authorities in the East. Many of these risks, of course, would abate over time. Okay. Regarding the Indians, 2 factors are to be noted. The colonial experience had witnessed over the 150 years of British settlement the tendency of the Indian nations to retreat and withdraw from confrontation with the British. And from the Long Hunters, it was known that the Cumberland Basin itself had no permanent year-round Indian presence. In a headnote in his chronicles, Clement states, quote, "Except for a few decades when the Shawnees lived along the river, the Cumberland Valley had been devoid of settlement for over 3 centuries." Close quote. Jesse Wills, in his Meditations on the American Indian, refers to Shawnee settlements being on the Cumberland in the late 17th century, but states that the Shawnee presence was short-lived, as the Shawnee were driven out by the combined efforts of the Chickasaw and Cherokee in 1714. Arnaud in Seed Time writes that from the time the French first learned of the Cumberland River, it was recognized as being a no man's land. The Indians of various tribes hunted here at times, but always so much blood was shed when they accidentally met that the Middle Cumberland came to be avoided as a hunting ground. So the risk of Indian resistance existed, but did that risk outweigh the opportunity to become a large landowner? We had a program a few weeks back here in which the 1976 reenactment of the Donaldson Voyage was described. And one of those of us attending that talk asked why someone coming from the eastern colonies already owning land there would want to come here for land. Well, the answer is land, land, and more land. It was an obsession. In addition to the specific skills the pioneers possessed, they also brought with them helpful, intangible qualities. They had learned to a high degree the ability to govern themselves. This trait answered the risk of moving to an area beyond the reach of the institutions of order in the eastern mother colony. There was the common bond of the people's pride. Men with good opinions of themselves are inclined to have good opinions of their fellow man. Arnaud observes that the Scotch-Irish talent for self-government and imposing order upon themselves was the outgrowth of their religious lives. They did not need a bishop to structure how they lived their faith. Their representative sessions and presbyteries filled the need for the episcopal function. This, to me, is a very impressive insight. They also possess the advantage of not being overly worried concerning about personal safety. Arnaud describes this outlook, quote, "Certain it is that they were not in search of the 2 goals most men want today, those being security and survival. The pioneers had as a group a great flair for living and a love of life, too great to want to live like a turnip in a tightly picketed garden, safe," close quotes. The chance for gain was worth the risk. Land ownership was the foundation to a more prosperous life. So in the fall of 1779, James Robertson's party left Watauga, bound for the Cumberland River at the French Lick. They would make the trek. In the 1840s, a Robertson family member gave this description of his family's march through Kentucky. Clement's Chronicles includes this account. Quote, "In October of 1779, James Robertson, in company with his brothers Mark and John, his son Jonathan, 10 years old, and a Negro man of his own family, and several other persons, set out with the stock," that's livestock. There were some 12 or 15 men in the party. They went across the Cumberland Mountains from Kentucky and from there to where they intended settling so that they could carry their stock there. Robertson had some fine mares. He, with one of the men, led the van with the horses, and guided by his compass, he blazed out a path for those behind. Next was the cattle, and then the hogs, and lastly the sheep, driven by his oldest son, Jonathan. The van usually camped about sundown, and sometimes it was 3 or 4 hours in the night before Jonathan would come up with his sheep. They arrived in December and left their stock at Mansker's Creek to winter there where the pasturage was good. Toward the last of February, they drove Robertson's horses and cattle on the ice over the Cumberland River at the mouth of the Big Branch. They commenced to build the place which was afterwards called Freeland Station. This description tells us a lot about the first settlers. They were not moving here empty-handed. They were bringing with them herds and flocks. They were bringing dogs, horses, working tools, seeds for planting, and household items. And they brought their knowledge of how to farm and how to live on a wilderness frontier, and how to exploit the resources of the bountiful forest. Of significance is that none of these westward marching parties encountered Indian resistance or attack. Many histories refer to the Buchanan party as being in the South Carolina backcountry before heading west. The party included John Sr., his wife, 2 daughters, and 3 sons, Alexander, Major John, and Samuel. They passed into what is now Kentucky through the Cumberland Gap. How many of you have visited the national park there? It's quite impressive. It is thought that John Buchanan Sr., his wife, and daughters spent the winter of 1779-1780 at Clark Station near today's Danville, Kentucky. Samuel may have remained there as well, as many accounts name only Alexander and Major John as arriving at the French Lick in December 1779. Major John and his older brother Alexander's and others, upon their arrival, immediately began construction of a walled compound above a spring on the bluff above the river where Fort Nashville stands today. When the James Robertson party arrived later on, they elected to build Freeland Station, as mentioned above, near where Morgan Park is today, north of the Nashville Sounds baseball field. A third station, the original Heaton's, was built on the east side of the river on land which will be included within the future Oracle campus. In addition to building housing and defensive fortifications, these settlers had to clear areas for spring planting. In May 1780, a document known as the Cumberland Compact was signed by 244 men here. None of my Buchanan forebears signed it, and I have wondered, why not? The Cumberland Compact was authored by Richard Henderson and chiefly involved details as to how the land purchase agreements with the Transylvania Company would be finalized. Since the Buchanans had no contract to buy land through the Transylvania Company, it makes sense to me that Major John and Alexander would have no reason to sign the compact. I do not think that John Buchanan Sr. arrived with the women until the summer of 1780 after the Cumberland Compact was executed. The Cumberland Compact also contained provisions regarding self-government and with representatives from the several stations allocated votes to create a governing body. Here you can see I can't really read what's in the upper left part. That's around Clarksville. Fort Union. That's up the Red River from Clarksville, and Manskers is in Sumner County. Freeland's, Heaton's, and Nashboro are here and around downtown Nashville. Stones River, of course, is the Hermitage area. Work on, what's that?
What year was this?
The Cumberland Compact was 1780. Work on the French Lick Station continued. When completed, it enclosed an acre and a half with corner block houses and a row of cabins. Let me mention this about the Cumberland Compact. It was signed in 1780, but it had been completely forgotten until the 1840s, when a copy of it was found in a trunk in an attic. And so, oh, look at this. This is sort of an early declaration of self-government. So anyway, that's now there's a big monument outside the Davidson County Courthouse commemorating the fact that there was a Cumberland Compact. 1781 proved to be an eventful year for the Cumberland settlement. In early April, Indians attacked, Freeland Station was abandoned and its families fled for the protection of the French Lick Station. The Indian attack continued there, but the settlers won the day by releasing their dogs, which helped drive the Indians away. Unfortunately, Alexander Buchanan was gravely wounded defending the station and died. But in 1781 was the year Major John produced his Book of Arithmetic, which for many years was on display in the Tennessee State Museum. Look at the artistry of that cotton plant. I think that's a cotton plant. This book focused on the ways, described the math lessons Major John learned from early fellow settler James Mulherin. The book focused on the ways to correctly measure and compute land areas, determine boundary line angles, and how to break down irregularly shaped plots into triangles and rectangles to find the correct total area of a tract. Major John must have learned his lessons well, because he was soon to be actively engaged in surveying work to establish the boundaries of the many land grants soon to be awarded. In fact, Pereira's Atlas commends Buchanan's surveying work, noting the diligence reflected in his surveys and his identifications of streams, buffalo paths, traces, and other features of the land with great care and obvious pride. In 1780, the North Carolina General Assembly agreed that each Cumberland settler who was 21 years old and living what would become the North Carolina Military District prior to June 1, 1780, would receive a 640-acre grant. In 1782, the military district was created, which included all of the Middle Cumberland Basin. In 1783, North Carolina rejected the land claim of the Transylvania Company and created Davidson County as a North Carolina county. In 1784, North Carolina acknowledged that Major John qualified to receive a 640-acre grant, as did John Buchanan Sr. and the heirs of Alexander. In 1783, Major John was made a lieutenant in the state militia, a sign of the respect he had earned as early as age 24. In 1784, Major John, his father, and Samuel began work on a new fort on Mill Creek in today's Donaldson neighborhood to become known as Buchanan Station. This was located upon Major John's 640-acre land grant. Building Buchanan Station meant starting all over again, but on land owned by Major John this time. The North Carolina land grants could be sold and assigned. The 1,500 separate land grants documented in Pereira's Atlas shows Major John having acquired and registered in his name grants totaling 4,753 acres. He no doubt continued to buy and sell land on the Cumberland the rest of his life. Misfortune again came in 1786 as his brother Samuel was scalped and killed while plowing near Buchanan Station. In the following year, John Buchanan Sr. was killed in an Indian attack. Major John married in 1786, and his firstborn son was born in 1787, but his wife Margaret died from childbirth complications. With the death of his wife, how must Major John have regarded his coming to the Cumberland? His father and two brothers were killed, and now his wife was gone. Again, Arnaud offers this view of how death was regarded on the frontier. Arnaud speculates that Major John would not have thought too much on these losses. Quote, "Mostly those who settled the Cumberland were people with no time for looking back. The world for them was here and now, not theirs to remember or adjust to, but theirs to shape." Close quote. Major John did indeed move forward. He remarried in 1791 and had 13 more children. The likely reason history remembers Major John involves the events of late September 1792. Indian attacks had been rumored late that summer. As recalled by John Buchanan Todd, Major John's nephew, Indians visited Buchanan Station in August 1792 to scope out the layout of the fort. Yet Major John received the Indian visitors cordially, exhibiting no racial animus. Later report had discounted the risk of an attack, As it turned out, Indian leadership was divided as to the best strategy. Should the Bluff Station be attacked first, followed by attacks on the outlying stations, or the other way around? At the last minute, Buchanan Station learned to expect the initial attack, and it was ready. When the attack came on September 30th, 1792, a force of 200 to 900 Indians, why so vague, I don't know, tried to overwhelm the 19 male defenders of Buchanan Station. But after 2 hours of action, the Indians withdrew. There were no settler casualties. This was the last significant conflict between the Indians and the Cumberland pioneers in Davidson County. Major John's life continued to move forward. A 1795 list of licensed whiskey distillers showed him to be one of the largest. He built a grist mill at Buchanan Station, which proved to be one of the area's most productive mills. When Major John needed to bring suit to collect a debt owed to him, he hired Nashville attorney Andrew Jackson to represent him. While skilled as a surveyor and as the operator of a distillery and grist mill, Major John was primarily a farmer. With his extensive land ownership, he produced more corn and wheat than was needed to feed his household, farm workers, and livestock. Thus came his operation of a distillery and grist mill. They provided a way corn and wheat could be processed to create a marketable product. He likely raised cotton and tobacco as well. On the left is a portrait of Major John, painted in 1832, the year of his death. And then the photograph is me at Major John's headstone, taken just last Friday.
He looks like his reincarnation.
What can be said in summation of Major John's life here? He achieved what he had hoped for upon his arrival 52 years earlier. He had witnessed the settlement of Middle Tennessee, not as a result of conquering armies, but by the steady advance of family farms across the region. Major John and his fellow early settlers had not pioneered any new system of government or religion or agriculture, but he and his fellow settlers had successfully transplanted a known way of life to a new home. It was a job well done. Now let's push forward to 1879. The Buchanan family has been in Middle Tennessee for a century. At this point in time, Major John's grandson, Thomas Buchanan, born in 1832, was living on the Williamson County farm which Major John had left to Thomas's father. The Nissan headquarters campus now includes this property. Thomas had not participated in the Civil War, but his son, John Price Buchanan, had done so. He joined the Confederate forces at age 17 in late 1864 and was a courier until the end of the war. In this century year, 1879, John Price was operating a farm in Rutherford County between Murfreesboro and Manchester. Through these two farmers, we can learn about the impact of the Civil War and Reconstruction on agricultural life in Middle Tennessee. Click. The 1850 census lists Thomas Buchanan as a farmer with land valued at $4,500. By the 1860 census, Thomas reported the value of his lands at $16,000, with other property, including 22 slaves, valued at $15,000. These figures would suggest his having over 1,000 acres in cultivation or pasture and substantial farming operations. Thomas Buchanan was wealthy relative to most of his neighbors, but was not an aristocrat. Then occurred the Civil War and extensive wartime action around his Williamson County farm. My family lived through the Civil War upheaval, and in the war's aftermath, it was as though the Buchanan family was having to start all over again. The 1870 census reflects the economic loss, with Thomas valuing his real estate now at only $7,600 and his personal property, with the slaves having been freed, at $1,500. But with that valuation, Thomas was again among the more affluent. Civil War action had crisscrossed Middle Tennessee for 4 long years. The resulting devastation was in evidence mile after mile, with homes, barns, fencing, and trees burned, herds stolen or slaughtered, bridges and rail lines in ruins. And the agricultural labor force was turned on its head, with white farm owners and their former enslaved workers having to learn how to come together in a new South. These factors delayed a return of cotton production to its pre-war level. But the United States needed cotton production because the sale of cotton on the international market was the principal source of gold flowing into the United States. The need for cotton production caused new acreage to be planted in the Southwest and California, and within but a few years there was an oversupply of American-grown cotton, leading to the collapse of cotton prices over the 25 years following Appomattox. Other agricultural products also lost value over that period. Prices and credit were not the only problems farmers faced. Farmers perceived freight rates as being unfairly set by the railroads and state railroad commissions. And the national economic policy, which was to promote industrial growth over agricultural concerns, had farmers facing despair in all directions. Tennessee farmers also had to deal with the crisis of the state of Tennessee faced in developing a way to handle the state debt. Which part of Tennessee's economic pie would be taxed to deal with the state debt, the agricultural sector or the state's nascent industrial sector? These were the economic realities that 56-year-old Thomas and his 32-year-old son John Price faced in 1879. It was not only Tennessee farmers who recognized the economic hurdles which farmers faced following the Civil War. Organizations of farmers across Texas, Arkansas, and other Midwestern locales organizations of farmers grew up to protest the injustices aligned against the farmers' interest. These movements, known as the Farmers Alliance, the Agricultural Wheel, or other quasi-fraternal assemblies, were growing in influence in the 1870s and 80s. My family was part of this experience. In 1881, a proposed settlement of the Tennessee state debt issue was put forth. Strong discontent with this settlement plan made itself felt immediately. The Rutherford County Democrats held an indignation meeting chaired by a 34-year-old livestock farmer named John Price Buchanan, my great-grandfather and the great-grandson of Major John. This meeting saw the proposed debt settlement plan as a step on the way to serfdom for Tennessee farmers. By 1883, John Price Buchanan had formally joined the Rutherford County Agricultural Society, which organization encouraged farmers to read about agricultural issues, to think for themselves, and to be proud of their occupation. Plans were made to create cooperative stores or co-ops to lessen the dependence of farmers on retail merchants. In 1886 and again in 1888, John Price Buchanan was elected as a member of the state legislature, where he sponsored pro-farmer bills and promoted broader public education. He was elected president of the Tennessee Farmers Alliance at its first session in the summer of 1888 and again in 1889 after the Tennessee Alliance and the Wheel organization had merged. While Buchanan's involvement with the Alliance was growing, so was a split in the state Democratic Party. There was the establishment or Bourbon Wing, which included many former Confederate leaders and supported traditional interests. A second faction was the New South Democrats, who favored increased industrial investment in the state. The third faction was the farmers. For the governor's election of 1890, the Bourbons favored Josiah Patterson of Memphis, while the New South Democrats supported Jerry Baxter of Nashville. But the Farmers Alliance and its newspaper, the Weekly Toiler, insisted that the nomination go to Alliance President John Price Buchanan. Buchanan prevailed at that summer's convention after 3 days, winning on the 26th ballot. He won the November general election and assumed the office in February 1891. He was only 43 years old. Here are two images of my great-grandfather. This was said of the legislative program carried out under his administration. The farmer-dominated General Assembly under Buchanan surprised critics by avoiding the extremes advocated by Western agrarians and illustrated generally the conservatism of the Tennessee Farmers Alliance. Several beneficial laws were enacted. One provided for closer regulation of the sale of commercial fertilizers. Another awarded pensions of $25 per month for totally disabled Confederate veterans. Other laws were made more effective, and the poll tax requirement for voting passed during the Taylor administration made trust and other combinations and restraint of trade and production unlawful, and restricted foreign corporations which did business within the state. One-time state historian Robert White says of Buchanan, he might be termed about the last survivor of his day and generation, who helped rescue and preserve the Anglo-Saxon civilization which was characteristic of the Old South. Buchanan's administration as governor, quote, rescued the state from the grasp of vindictive politicians and scallywags, close quote. A coal field strike created problems for Governor Buchanan. For decades, Tennessee had funded a portion of the cost of operating the state's prisons by leasing convicts to engage in various physical work, including work in the East Tennessee coal fields. Civilian miners resented the wage competition that contract prison workers caused. In 1891, the civilian miners went on strike to protest, and there were attacks on the leased prisoners' workforce. Although Buchanan saw the injustice of a system of leased prisoner work, it was a system he was stuck with. He called out the state militia to bring order to the coal fields, but he did so without first obtaining legislative support for his doing so. This led to lots of second guessing as the 1892 election season neared. The Bourbons put their house in order, and Peter Turney, then Chief Justice of the Tennessee Supreme Court, won the Democratic nomination. Buchanan ran as an independent candidate but lost. He never sought elective office again, although family lore is that John Price Buchanan was to have served as U.S. Secretary of Agriculture in a third Grover Cleveland administration. Governor Buchanan continued to farm. He and his wife had 8 children. A son, Thomas, became a Cumberland Presbyterian minister. Another son, Robert, my grandfather, earned a degree in medicine from the University of Nashville in 1905 and established a rural practice outside of Gallatin, Tennessee. Governor Buchanan died in 1930. So with respect to Governor Buchanan, foe of the scallywag, preserver of Anglo-Saxon civilization, let's number him among the good guys. Click. This is a photograph of Governor Buchanan's younger brother, James Shannon Buchanan. He was born in 1864 in Franklin, just when his older brother, the governor, was leaving home to join the Confederate forces. James Shannon Buchanan graduated from Cumberland University in Lebanon in 1885. He became the superintendent of public education in Nashville in the early 1890s. I don't know whether that was in his brother's administration or not, could have been. He took graduate work in history at Vanderbilt and the University of Chicago. In 1898, he joined the faculty of nascent University of Oklahoma and became its president in 1923 to 1925. Click. Let's run the calendar up another century. It's 1779, and we will review the experience of the Buchanan clan through the lives of 2 first cousins, both grandsons of the governor. Can you show that? One of them's my father there, and then the other is James McGill, Jim Buchanan Jr. Those are the 2 first cousins. Let's see how we're doing with time here. I'm going to have to skip my father in the interest of time. Don't? No? Okay, thank you. All right.
You want more?
All right. The first cousin is my father, Robert N. Buchanan Jr., born in 1911 at Hendersonville, Tennessee. His father is the community doctor, delivering babies, setting broken bones, referring cases beyond his competency to specialists in Nashville. In addition to practicing medicine, he operates a farm. There is a dairy herd, some sheep, chickens, a tobacco base, and the vegetable garden. My father is introduced to the joys of plowing at an early age and resolves to dedicate himself to his studies so that he can go to college, hopefully Vanderbilt. I guess there's something inspiring about looking at the backside of a mule for a period of time that leads one to believe that there are alternatives available. My father entered Vanderbilt as a 16-year-old freshman in 1927. He continued to live at home. No fraternity life for my father. Depression-era realities precluded non-essential activities. He was accepted to Vanderbilt Medical School after 3 years of undergraduate study. He was awarded a Commonwealth Fund scholarship for medical school, which made it easier for his 2 younger siblings to follow him to Vanderbilt. He graduated with a medical degree in 1934. My father did internships at Vanderbilt and at Cleveland City Hospital. He then had to practice 2 years in a town of no larger than 5,000 as a condition to his Commonwealth Fund scholarship. He found that opportunity in Lebanon, Tennessee, where he worked at the Martha Gaston Hospital with Dr. Gaston. After 2 years there, he was accepted into a dermatology residency program at the Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. Living there opened the world to him. He returned to Nashville after becoming board certified in dermatology and joined an established dermatological practice in Nashville. Shortly after World War II was declared, my father joined the Vanderbilt unit, which was a general hospital unit. He went with that unit to North Africa and Italy. By the war's end, he was a lieutenant colonel and was the chief consultant for dermatology for all Allied medical units in the Mediterranean theater. This war experience probably opened the way for him to become pretty deeply engaged with the Veterans Administration when my father returned to his practice in Nashville. The Veterans Administration was having to plan, of course, for how to provide medical services for the returning veterans that they knew would be required over the following decades. My father had rejoined the Vanderbilt Medical School faculty as a clinical professor in dermatology. He also re-engaged with the Nashville Academy of Medicine, becoming president of the Nashville Academy in 1955. With his combined involvement with Vanderbilt, the Nashville Academy of Medicine, and the Veterans Administration, my father pushed for what he considers his most significant professional achievement, that is, influencing the move of Nashville's Veterans Hospital from White Bridge Road to its present location adjacent to the Vanderbilt Medical Campus. This relationship created beds for the Vanderbilt students, residents, and interns to see patients, VA patients. It provided research dollars for Vanderbilt medical faculty to get research grants through the Veterans Administration. My father had significant achievements in various areas of life. He was president of the National Vanderbilt Alumni Association. He was president of Belmead Country Club. He served on the Belmead Board of Zoning Appeals. And he was president of every professional association he was a member of. In all these efforts, he credits his success to the social skills and graces of my mother. And I apologize for not mentioning more women in this talk, but my father had great success, and he credits my mother, and she says she always liked sitting at the head table, and I got to do so being my father's wife. So, now, my father had a younger first cousin. There's a portrait of my father. He died at age 93. My father had a younger first cousin, James Jim McGill Buchanan, born in 1919 on the Buchanan stock farm between Murfreesboro and Manchester. You know the location because of the I-24 interstate exit at Buchanan Road. Jim Buchanan's father was the governor's youngest son, who after 2 years playing football at the University of Oklahoma, had returned to Tennessee to run his father's stock farm operation. Jim grew up in a 14-room house, but it lacked electrification, plumbing, or central heat. Although Jim grew up dreaming of attending Vanderbilt and becoming a lawyer, the reality of the Depression economy found him living at home in the late 1930s, milking cows and performing other chores which allowed him to cover the fees needed to attend the State Normal College in Murfreesboro. Jim Buchanan excelled in his studies, graduating first in his class in 1940 with majors in mathematics, English literature, and social science. He received a fellowship to study economics at the University of Tennessee for the 1940-41 academic year. Buchanan later, looking back on his year in Knoxville, wrote, quote, "The graduate year in Knoxville, Tennessee helped me meet the world beyond. I learned no economics during that year, but I did learn about women and whiskey, which, after all, are important parts of an education." Close quotes. Buchanan planned to continue at Columbia University in its graduate program in statistics when the looming threat of a second European war intervened. Facing the prospect of the draft in August 1941, Buchanan enlisted in the Navy Officers Training Program and was sent, ironically, to Columbia University and its officers' school in New York City. Buchanan impressed his instructors at Columbia and was selected to receive additional training at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. He must have done well there, since his next posting was to the operations staff of Admiral Chester Nimitz at Pearl Harbor, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. There, Buchanan worked for a time under Nimitz's Chief of Staff, Admiral Raymond Spruance, the hero of Midway. I can imagine my cousin being asked to assess the logistical needs for various planned naval operations. The story is told of Admiral Spruance once introducing his subordinate. Quote, "This is Buchanan, who's mighty fast and fairly accurate." Close quote. Close quote. He thought about using that as the title for his published book of autobiographical essays. Jim Buchanan enjoyed his naval service but left in late 1945. The war won. Upon the advice of an MTSU faculty member, Buchanan next entered the PhD program in economics at the esteemed University of Chicago. There he met fellow University of Tennessee alumnus Frank Knight, who was also a Chicago faculty member. This experience ignited Buchanan's understanding of the economic significance of markets and led to his 60-year career as an academic economist and researcher. During that time, Buchanan authored or co-authored 39 books and nearly 300 articles for leading economic journals. Click. In 1986, his scholarship was recognized when he was awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences. My parents went to Stockholm in December 1986 to attend the Nobel Prize award ceremonies. Here in this photograph, you probably recognize the King of Sweden. The King is presenting my father's first cousin with the Nobel Prize. Buchanan's winning the prize had not been widely anticipated, and some in the economic establishment were dismissive of his work. As a youth growing up in the house owned by his grandfather, the governor, young Jim Buchanan read many of the populist and agrarian books from the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. Doing so left him suspicious of big banks, big business, and big government. He probably saw parallels between the economic challenges Tennessee farmers faced during and following Reconstruction and those Depression-era challenges his family experienced. As a result, Professor Buchanan describes himself as a libertarian socialist as he began his studies at Chicago. But as he states in a biographical essay, within 6 weeks of being introduced to Frank Knight's course on price theory, Buchanan was, quote, converted into a zealous advocate of the market order, close quotes. Among the 39 books Buchanan authored is a collection of biographical essays under the title Better Than Plowing. He and my father shared that attitude. The same title is the lead essay. None of the other Buchanans I have discussed left a written record for me to explore. I greatly enjoyed learning about my cousin through reading this collection of essays. But you did not come here today to hear an economics lecture, and I am not knowledgeable enough to deliver one. Buchanan was keenly interested in examining how freely choosing individuals make policy and political decisions. He thought that mid-20th century economists had failed to examine this topic. Buchanan believed that the economic concept of markets and exchanges could be used to shed light on how policymakers, acting as individuals, could reach agreement to secure jointly desired goals. Buchanan recognized the tension which exists when governments, by and large, seek to exert more and more control over the governed, while those governed want to preserve their own liberties while living in a social order. Buchanan's underlying purpose in developing what became labeled as the public choice school of economic thought was always to further philosophical support for individual liberties. In this work, Buchanan was going against the economic and political orthodoxies of his time, but doing so was characteristic of him. In his Better Than Plowing essay, Buchanan described the qualities of mind he hoped that he exemplified. Quote, the willingness to question anything and anybody on any subject, any time, the genuine openness to all ideas, and finally the basic conviction that most ideas peddled about are nonsense or worse when examined critically. Buchanan's reaction to his Nobel achievement is also worthy of mention. He frequently said that, quote, if Jim Buchanan can get a Nobel Prize, anyone can. Here was Jim Buchanan, a country boy from Middle Tennessee, educated in rural public schools and a local public teachers college, who is not associated with an established university, who has never shared the academically fashionable soft left ideology, who has worked in totally unorthodox subject matter with very old-fashioned tools of analysis. It was not at all surprising that the sycophants for the orthodoxies in both ideas and institutions were shocked and dismayed by my winning the prize. And it is indeed gratifying that members of the, quote, great unwashed, close quote, the unorthodox in many dimensions, looked upon me as the representative embodiment of that which might be. I came across two statements of my cousin which I think are illuminating. As a graduate student at Chicago, Buchanan did not worry about his ability to successfully complete the program, but he held ambitions beyond merely receiving a PhD. He hoped to enter the more narrow ranks of producing scholars who could generate ideas worthy of the serious attention of his peers. How was he able to meet this ambitious purpose? Two factors played their respective roles. First, a willingness to work longer and harder than others. He followed the advice he had been given at Chicago that, quote, keeping the ass to the chair, close quote, was a key to academic success. The second factor was his ability to resist discouragement. This character trait, he wrote, depends on the achievement early on of a constrained and realistic but finally unshakable self-confidence. A realistic self-confidence. A self-confidence which recognizes its limits, but a self-confidence which is unshakable. Ambition, hard work, self-confidence. Could we be speaking of Major John again? Late in his life, Professor Buchanan made a gift of $3 million to MTSU, a record donation at that time. His Nobel Prize medal is on permanent loan to MTSU, And to honor his association with the university, the MTSU Honors Student Program is referred to as the Buchanan Scholars. So that's the story of my family. I'm certainly that I could have included descriptions of other notable cousins had I been aware of my connection. But I believe that over the generation, my family has left its mark, and I appreciate this opportunity to share the story with you. Thank you.
Can you answer some questions?
Certainly.
You got any questions?
I can add-
Look at those hands.
All right. Yes, ma'am.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your career?
Sure, but that won't take long. I was fortunate to have been able to go to the Davidson County Public School, Palmer School, through the 6th grade, then to Montgomery Bell Academy. I then was able to go to Davidson College in Davidson, North Carolina. Got admitted to the Vanderbilt Law School and graduated from there in 1974. I was with the same law firm for about 45 years and have been retired 9 years. I was not a trial lawyer, so I never had to speak for an hour before. And I have 3 sons, and I'm honored that they all chose to come here today. One went to Vanderbilt and Belmont. One went to the University of Pennsylvania, and the third, who's wearing the Buchanan tartan, went to Columbia University. And I'm married to my wife, who is Sarah Litton Buchanan, who's an educator. And she worked at Innsworth School for 34 years, concluding her career as associate head of school there. Yes, sir.
I met James Buchanan in, I think it was right after he won the award, the congressional, I was living in the DC area at the time, and the congressional delegation, Senators Gore and Sasser, Congressman Mark Gordon, they held a reception for him there in the Capitol in Tennessee. MTSU Alumni Society was there. So I met him at that. Also, back in the 70s, I was a student at MTSU, and I was kind of involved in Democratic Party politics at the time. And there was a young man they would introduce at every Democratic meeting, every Democratic dinner, who was like about 8 or 9 years old, who they said he is a direct descendant of the last governor from
Rutherford County.
From Rutherford County. You know, I was wondering whatever happened to him.
Is that Jeff Worley?
I don't know who it was. I don't know
Okay.
what the name was.
Professor Buchanan's sister, Elizabeth Worley, was head of the,
I remember the name.
was it the campus school at MTSU. She had 2 sons by her first husband. She remarried, and her name is Elizabeth. It'll come to me in a minute. But anyway, Jeff Worley, her son, is a good friend of Bart Gordon's. He ran for Congress once. This is Professor Buchanan's nephew.
Yeah.
He was involved in the student loan program during the Clinton administration and ended up continuing his involvement of that after it became a private organization headquartered in Indianapolis, and has made a lot of money. He told me this story about visiting his uncle, whom he called Uncle Buck. My uncle was living in Blacksburg, Virginia at the time. He had a farm there, which he loved. It kept him grounded. He had been
Virginia Tech, right?
at Virginia Tech, yes. He had been at the University of Virginia, then went to UCLA in the mid-1960s. He hated UCLA. He hated he called it anarchy that he was seeing on campuses in the late 60s, so he left UCLA and moved back to Blacksburg, Virginia, and to ground himself, he bought a farm. But anyway, he was living in Blacksburg, and his nephew, Jeff Worley, was visiting him. They were driving around, and Professor Buchanan pointed to the Presbyterian church and said, "See that steeple?" He said, "That cost me $75,000. And Jeff said, "Uncle Buck, I thought you were sort of skeptical about religion, and not a great believer." He said, "I am, but I'm smart, and I believe in hedging my bets.
Can I ask you one other thing? You said he went to the University of Chicago, and did he have any influence from Senator Paul Douglas, who was a professor?
Well, I don't know when Senator Douglas was there. My uncle entered probably January 1946 and got his degree in 1948. Yes, sir. I'll get you in the back.
I have a PhD in economics from UCLA, and he was one of my professors.
Ah.
I had numerous arguments.
He was not a warm and fuzzy person, was he?
You know, and you mentioned what an advocate he was of individual freedom. However, one of the points I argued with him about was rights for homosexuals. And
That probably was beyond his kin.
He did not think rights should be extended to homosexuals. Part of his philosophy was we don't need the police to do the government to do the policing because we police ourselves. And we have decided as a society that homosexuality is unacceptable. So it's part of our self-censorship that we can't extend rights to them,
Yeah.
and we can remain free of government placing limits
Yeah.
on our rights.
I would think he'd to have a somewhat libertarian take on that.
Well,
But
so anyway, I remember having numerous, because I was one of those radical students.
anarchist. Okay. Hi, John. Yes.
Which cemetery is that the photograph was taken?
Well, there's a Buchanan family cemetery where Massman Drive meets Elm Hill Pike. And I had heard about it, but had never been there until last Friday. And it's a very pleasant little sylvan glen in an industrial area.
I'm pretty sure that the docent who's here from the other Buchanan group.
She's there.
Oh, right, yeah. That is maintained by the other Buchanan.
With the log house. Are you? But you're not involved in the upkeep of that Buchanan cemetery at Massman Drive in. No. So, Gene sent out an email to all of us about perhaps being interested in supporting the conservation of a home in Donaldson. And here are brochures about that I'll call your attention. Please take one if this appeal touches your heart.
Well, I only got one out last night. My cat came and sat on the keyboard and wouldn't let me. It was warm. And I'm going to send out the email I got from the Nashville archives. They are striving to raise $5,000 for upkeep. And so it's one of those things where you have to scan the QR code. For some of us, that may not be in our activity list at all. But anyway, I'm going to send it out, and maybe sometime you could make a small donation. Even a matter of dollars would add up, because they only are looking for around $5,000. And I know this is Giving Tuesday, and my emails have been filled with please give. And, yeah.
Are there other questions?
How are you related to the log,
How am I related to who?
the log house?
Well, I don't know of any relation.
Oh,
Oh,
You said that it's from
Archibald.
from Archibald,
Son James.
and whether he was, and his father was James. Yes.
We're Archibald and James Buchanan.
Okay.
From the Buchanan Log House that's raising the money.
okay. Well,
There is, I think, a James Buchanan that signed the Cumberland Compact,
Yes, he is.
but that's not my family. Yes.
I have two questions. The first question is, how
how long have you been actually compiling information on your family?
Well,
That's the first
I'm the
question.
oldest child, and so I listened at my father's knee. I'm 76 now, so I hope I've been paying attention all this time. But I have on this front table many of the books I used to prepare this talk, and these are all from my own home library. And whenever I would learn of a book which mentioned my family, I would tend to buy it to have a copy. So this is a multi-year process.
My second question is, what is the most shocking to you personally thing that you learned about your family in preparing this?
I had never been told that my forebearer arrived here prior to James Robertson. That came as a great surprise to me. I sort of had a notion that they were not formally associated with the Donaldson and Robertson parties, but I had no idea that they actually beat Robertson here. That they didn't see that as an honor. They just got here and got to work building a fort, which was to benefit all the people coming here.
Thank you so much, Bob. We enjoyed it.